In the autumn of 1965, the Higgins family vanished from their cottage on Church Lane in the village of Ashworth, Yorkshire. 4 people gone without warning. No struggle, no note, no witnesses. At first, it was treated as an unfortunate mystery, the kind rural constabularies quietly absorb into their filing cabinets when answers refuse to surface. It might have remained there forever. Another unanswered question eroded by time, if not for what was uncovered 3 months later beneath the ancient stones of St. Mary's Church. Hidden below the nave, sealed behind carefully disguised masonry, investigators found a chamber not marked on any architectural plans. Inside were personal belongings unmistakably tied to the Higgins family, along with handwritten journals describing ritual practices the Church of England had outlawed centuries earlier. Most disturbing of all was the final entry. It was dated 2 weeks after the Higgins family had officially disappeared. For nearly 60 years, the church refused to comment on the discovery. The Higgins cottage was never reoccupied, and when sealed church records were finally opened in 1985, it became clear that the Higgins family had not been the first to vanish under these circumstances. Tonight, we step back into that quiet Yorkshire village, guided by documents never meant to be seen, and testimony from the only surviving witness who has finally broken 4 decades of silence. Ashworth was a place where time moved differently. Nestled deep within the Yorkshire dales, surrounded by rolling hills that blushed purple with heather each autumn, the village housed barely 300 people. Many could trace their bloodlines back 5 or 6 generations, rooted in the same cottages, the same fields, the same gravestones. Outsiders were rare. Change was slower still. At the heart of Ashworth stood St. Mary's Church, a Norman structure built in 1187 atop the remnants of an even older Saxon chapel. Its limestone tower rose nearly 100 feet into the sky, weathered by centuries of wind sweeping down from the moors. Local folklore whispered that the ground beneath it had been sacred long before Christianity reached the dales. The massive oak doors, bound with iron darkened by age, groaned in the wind like something half asleep. That autumn brought an unnatural chill. Leaves turned early, staining the hills in bruised reds and golds. Fog began pooling in the valley each evening, thick and clinging, wrapping itself around gravestones and stone walls as though reluctant to let go. Villagers spoke of becoming disoriented in the churchyard at dusk, familiar paths seeming to twist and shift in the haze. Even the bells of St. Mary's sounded wrong. Mrs. Agnes Petton, who had lived beside the church for more than 60 years, noticed first. The tone had deepened, grown heavier. Sometimes, late at night, she swore she heard them ringing when they should not have been. Soft, mournful peals that seemed to rise not from the tower, but from beneath the earth. Thomas Arthur Higgins was not a man given to imagination. At 38, his life followed a precise order inherited from his father and grandfather before him. Each morning at 7, he left his cottage in a pressed suit, leather satchel in hand, walked his children to school, and continued on to the post office where he sorted mail for the valley. Quiet, dependable, deeply devout without being showy, Thomas served as a church warden at St. Mary's, arranging hymnals and polishing collection plates with steady hands and unshaken faith. His wife, Elelena Mary Higgins, née Whitlock, had arrived in Ashworth 15 years earlier as a young bride. At 35, her dark hair still caught the light, her beauty softened but undimmed by village life. She kept the cottage with careful precision, yet there was something restless in her, an attentiveness that reached beyond daily routines. Elelena spent long hours in the village library, reading about ancient customs and forgotten practices of the Dales. Her garden brimmed with herbs and wildflowers older villagers recognized but no longer named aloud. When asked about her interests, she only smiled and said she believed in keeping old traditions alive. Their children were well loved. Margaret Rose, 12, was thoughtful and serious, a gifted student who seemed older than her years. She copied inscriptions from ancient headstones into a notebook she carried everywhere. Billy, 8, was the village charmer, endlessly curious, especially about the church. He sketched gargoyles, windows, towers, and as autumn deepened, darker images his teacher struggled to understand. Ashworth moved by rhythms set long ago. Market day on Thursdays, evenings at the Shepherd's Rest, the post office doubling as a general store. But beneath this calm surface lay something older, guarded by the village's founding families. The Thorntons, the Carrs, the Weatherbys, names spoken with familiarity and quiet authority. Knowledge passed carefully along bloodlines, customs unshared with outsiders. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the village librarian, was one such keeper. Her cottage housed manuscripts the church had once tried to erase. Dr. Edmund Carr, the village physician, blended modern medicine with teachings inherited from his grandmother. Even Reverend Harold Whitmore, who had served St. Mary's for 23 years, had changed. His sermons grew dense with references to older truths, deeper mysteries. His study overflowed with artifacts and texts that sat uneasily beside Anglican theology. In the weeks before the Higgins family disappeared, changes became impossible to ignore. Elelena lingered in the churchyard after dark. Thomas grew distracted, hollow-eyed. The children withdrew. Mrs. Petton noticed Elelena carrying bundles through the fog at night. Herbs, candles, objects she couldn't identify. When questioned, Elelena replied calmly, "I'm tending to old traditions. Someone has to keep the proper observances." At the general store, Elelena purchased coarse salt, white candles, and specific herbs in unusual quantities. She said it was for the harvest. Miss Sarah Collins, the schoolteacher, grew alarmed by Margaret's essays, filled with references to ancient wisdom, and by Billy's drawings. Robed figures encircling an altar marked with unfamiliar symbols. When asked, Billy said only that he was drawing what Mommy and Mr. Whitmore taught him about the old church. Thomas tried to intervene. He met with Reverend Whitmore in September, hoping for reassurance. Instead, he was told of obligations older than personal choice, of families chosen to uphold protections long forgotten. Thomas left shaken, sensing a threat that was never spoken aloud. By October, his health deteriorated. Insomnia, dread, a certainty that something had begun which could not be stopped. The final Sunday of the month, October 31st, dawned gray and smothered in fog. The Higgins family attended morning service as always, yet something was wrong. Elelena took notes as Whitmore preached of ancient covenants and the necessity of completion. The children sat unnaturally still. That afternoon, they returned home quickly, ignoring Mrs. Petton's greeting. By nightfall, the cottage went dark. Sometime after midnight, Mrs. Petton awoke to chanting. From her window, she watched figures in dark robes circle St. Mary's, candles flickering in the mist. The voices rose and fell, and among them, she heard children. Then the procession moved toward the church and vanished. The next morning, the Higgins family was gone. Sergeant Robert Henley arrived to find the cottage immaculate. Dinner eaten, clothes laid out, wallets and purses left behind. But candles, books, and herbal preparations were missing. On Thomas's desk lay an open Bible, revelation marked with 2 lines of handwriting. The old covenant must be honored at all costs. God help us all. I fear we have gone too far to turn back. What Sergeant Henley would soon uncover beneath St. Mary's Church would prove those words were not metaphor, nor madness, but a final, desperate warning. Sergeant Henley's initial interviews yielded little more than polite evasions and uneasy half-truths. Ashworth closed ranks quickly, not in open defiance, but in the subtle way small villages have perfected over centuries. Doors opened, tea was poured, voices remained calm, and answers slipped sideways. Everyone agreed the Higgins family had been acting strangely. No one could say where they had gone. No one could explain why they would leave without warning, without money, without telling a soul. It was the school teacher, Miss Sarah Collins, who broke the pattern. 3 days after the disappearance, she arrived at the constable's office carrying a bundle of papers she had not slept since deciding to hand over. Billy Higgins's drawings, Margaret's essays. Henley spread them across his desk and felt something tighten in his chest. The images were too deliberate, the symbols too consistent, the writing too mature, too certain. These were not childish imaginings. They were echoes. Henley returned to St. Mary's Church with a different eye. What had once seemed like the benign irregularities of an ancient building now stood out with unsettling clarity. Walls that were too thick, angles that refused to reconcile, measurements that left voids where no rooms should exist. Behind the altar, stones fitted with exceptional care yielded under pressure, revealing a narrow passage descending into the rock beneath the church. The air grew colder as Henley climbed down. The stone steps were worn smooth, not by centuries of feet, but by repeated, deliberate use. At the bottom, the passage opened into a circular chamber roughly 30 feet across. Its walls were carved with a disturbing blend of Christian iconography and symbols far older, their meanings long stripped from common memory. At the center stood a black stone altar, massive and unmistakably ancient. Candles lay melted into the floor. Bundles of dried herbs hung from iron hooks. The smell was suffocating, incense layered over something metallic and sour. Then Henley saw the objects arranged with reverent care around the altar. A wedding ring, a pocket watch, a school ribbon. A toy soldier, its paint chipped from years of handling. The Higgins family had been here. Scattered throughout the chamber were journals, some recent, some brittle with age. The newest were written in Elena Higgins's careful hand, charting her journey from curiosity to devotion. Early entries spoke of folklore, seasonal rites, harmless study. Then the tone shifted. She wrote of true faith and old wisdom, of Christianity as a veil laid over something purer, stronger. She described ceremonies held in the chamber, first symbolic, then participatory. She wrote of the harvest ceremony with reverence bordering on ecstasy. According to Elena, the ritual required a complete family. It could only be performed on certain nights, when the boundary between worlds thinned. The chosen family would not perish, she wrote. They would be elevated, transformed, bound forever into the protection of the land and the people upon it. Her final entry, dated October 30th, radiated certainty, gratitude. She expressed only mild concern over Thomas's reluctance, noting that Reverend Whitmore had assured her all doubts would be resolved before dawn. Beneath a loose stone in the chamber floor, Henley found the older journal. It was bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and fragile. Multiple hands filled its margins. The earliest entries dated back to the early 1920s, authored by Father Michael Blackwood, Whitmore's predecessor. Blackwood wrote of discovering the chamber during renovations, of symbols that spoke to him, of voices that answered when he meditated alone in the dark. What began as fascination curdled into obsession. Blackwood became convinced the chamber demanded more than study, that it required action. His entries described rituals designed to protect the village from famine, illness, outsiders. By 1928, he had gathered followers, many bearing names Henley now recognized: the Thorntons, the Carrs, the Weatherbys. Then came the first elevation. October 1930, the Morrison family. Blackwood described their deaths with chilling detachment, framing them as sacred necessity. Afterward, the pattern repeated every few years. Families disappeared, stories were crafted, cottages reassigned, questions smothered under social pressure and fear. When Blackwood died in 1942, the ritual paused, but not for long. Reverend Whitmore arrived in 1943. His early entries revealed horror at what he discovered. Then rationalization, prayer, interpretation of coincidence as divine approval. By 1947, he resumed the ceremonies with refinements learned from his predecessors' mistakes. He selected families carefully, those isolated enough to vanish quietly, pliable enough to be guided to their fate. The journal listed them with methodical precision: the Fletchers, the Ashfords, the Kellys, the Bradfords, the Hawkins, the Pattersons, and finally, the Higgins family. Whitmore's writings detailed his techniques: recruitment through legitimate historical study, gradual introduction of esoteric ideas, isolation, fasting, long hours in the chamber's cold, echoing dark. He wrote of how altered states came easily there, how suggestions settled deep when reinforced by community and ritual. By the time a family was selected, they believed. Elelenena's journal showed this transformation in painful clarity. She became not just a participant, but an advocate, a recruiter, a believer who helped usher her own children toward the altar. Whitmore's final account of October 31, 1965 was brutally efficient. 11 people gathered in the chamber. Wine laced with what he called spiritual substances, chanting, candlelight. When Thomas resisted, others restrained him. The children were already disoriented. The killings were swift. The bodies were carried into natural caves beneath the church, part of a system used for decades. By the time Henley emerged from the chamber, the case had transformed. This was no missing persons investigation. It was a mass grave hidden beneath holy ground. The arrests that followed shattered Ashworth. Dr. Carr broke first, confessing to years of self-deception, insisting he believed the ceremonies were transcendence, not murder. Mrs. Thornton held out longer, until personal effects from multiple families were found in her home. Reverend Whitmore was arrested in his study, burning papers, muttering about obligations and covenants that could not be broken. The trial at York Crown Court in 1966 exposed the full scope of the horror. 17 families, 63 victims, entire bloodlines erased. Forensic teams recovered remains from the caves beneath St. Mary's, confirming decades of ritualized murder. Ashworth did not survive the truth. The church was deconsecrated and demolished, the chamber sealed, homes abandoned. By 1970, the village had hollowed into a ghost of itself, roads cracking, gardens overgrown, silence settling where bells once rang. Yet the most unsettling legacy of Ashworth was not the crimes themselves, but how quietly they had endured, how ordinary people, bound by tradition and trust, were guided step by step into darkness without ever feeling the moment they crossed the line. When you're ready, we'll continue into the final reckoning and the question Ashworth leaves behind. The trials concluded in the autumn of 1966, but the story of Ashworth did not end when the verdicts were read. In many ways, that was only the beginning. What had been exposed in the courtroom was not merely a series of murders, but the anatomy of a community that had learned to survive by silence. Reverend Harold Whitmore was found guilty but mentally ill. The court accepted psychiatric testimony that his delusions had been long-standing. Yet it was equally clear that they had never prevented him from planning, organizing, and concealing murder with chilling precision. He was committed indefinitely to a secure psychiatric facility, where he would spend the remainder of his life insisting that Ashworth owed its continued existence to his work. He never expressed remorse, only frustration that the covenant had been broken. Dr. Edmund Carr received a life sentence. In his final testimony, he spoke quietly, almost clinically, about the techniques used to suppress doubt. He described how language itself had been altered within the group, how murder became transition, fear became resistance, and death was reframed as completion. He admitted that, over time, this vocabulary made it possible to act without feeling, to participate without believing one was doing harm. Mrs. Margaret Thornton was sentenced alongside him. Her confession revealed how deeply the killings had been woven into Ashworth's social and economic fabric. Property from murdered families had been redistributed, their cottages rented or sold to fund the society's activities. Disappearances were not just tolerated, they were useful. They removed inconvenient families, consolidated influence, reinforced loyalty. Several others received shorter sentences for their roles in concealment and intimidation. The court acknowledged the psychological coercion many had endured, but emphasized that silence, when it shields the murder of children, is not neutrality. It is participation. As forensic teams continued their work beneath the ruins of St. Mary's, the numbers grew more unbearable. 17 families, 63 individuals, infants, parents, grandparents. The remains told their own story. Many showed signs of restraint, sedation, prolonged fear. The children's bones bore the quiet evidence of terror no ritual could sanctify. The revelation sent shockwaves far beyond Yorkshire. Scholars, criminologists, psychologists, and theologians descended on the case, searching for explanations that could contain it. They found none that offered comfort. Ashworth had not been ruled by a tyrant. It had not existed under occupation or famine or war. It had been peaceful, stable, ordinary. And that was the most frightening conclusion of all. Ashworth demonstrated that atrocity does not require chaos. It can grow slowly, nourished by trust, tradition, and the belief that authority knows better than conscience. The rituals had not begun with blood. They began with meetings, with history, with a shared sense of purpose. By the time murder entered the room, it no longer looked like murder to those who had been carefully taught not to see it. The Church of England issued a formal statement of condemnation and initiated sweeping reforms in rural oversight. Parish autonomy was curtailed. Background reviews intensified. Yet privately, many within the institution acknowledged the deeper wound, the realization that faith itself could be weaponized, not through fanaticism, but through patience. Law enforcement agencies revised protocols for missing persons investigations, particularly in isolated communities. Patterns that had once been dismissed as coincidence were now recognized as warning signs. But these reforms came too late for Ashworth's dead. The village itself could not recover. Families who had lived there for generations left within months of the trials. Some could not bear the memory. Others feared the stigma. A few admitted in later interviews that staying felt like an act of complicity, living on soil enriched by bones they had chosen not to see. St. Mary's Church was dismantled stone by stone. The underground chamber was filled with concrete and buried beneath grass. No marker was placed, no memorial erected. Officials feared it would become a place of pilgrimage for the wrong kind of visitor. The absence was meant to be closure. It was not. By the early 1970s, Ashworth was effectively abandoned. The post office closed. The school fell silent. The Higgins cottage, last in a line of homes forever associated with unanswered absence, was demolished and carted away. What remained was a scattering of empty structures and overgrown lanes, slowly being reclaimed by the Dales. For those who survived, those who had known, suspected, or sensed something was wrong, the damage lingered. Many struggled with guilt that surfaced years later, uninvited and unrelenting. They asked themselves why they had ignored the signs, why it was easier to accept comforting explanations than to ask dangerous questions. Children who grew up in Ashworth during the years of the killings carried a particular burden. They learned, far too early, that adults could lie convincingly, that institutions meant to protect could instead demand sacrifice. Some required decades to trust again. Some never did. The journals recovered from beneath St. Mary's are now sealed, accessible only to select researchers under strict conditions. Those who have read them describe a slow descent rather than a sudden fall. A reminder that belief does not turn monstrous overnight. It erodes, it justifies, it reframes. The Higgins family appears again and again in academic discussions, not because their story was unique, but because it was typical. They were not chosen for defiance or difference. They were chosen because they trusted, because they belonged, because they believed that their community, their church, and their neighbors would never ask something of them that was truly wrong. That trust was their undoing. Ashworth forces an uncomfortable reckoning. It asks how many truths we accept, because questioning them would cost us belonging. How often we mistake tradition for virtue, silence for peace, and authority for wisdom. It reminds us that evil rarely announces itself with violence at first. More often, it arrives politely, patiently. It asks for understanding, then loyalty, then obedience. And by the time it demands blood, it no longer needs to explain why. The ground where Ashworth once stood is quiet now. Sheep graze where cottages stood. Heather grows where footsteps once passed daily. There are no bells, no voices, no sign that beneath the soil lies a history soaked in devotion and death. But history does not require witnesses to endure. It waits, and it leaves behind stories like this, not to frighten us with the past, but to warn us about ourselves.